Everyone said mountain air clears the soul, but what do you do when that same air carries the sound of strangers calling the cops on your own home? That is what I felt the moment I stepped out of my truck that October afternoon. Cold pine wind cut across the meadow like a warning. My boots hit the gravel and it crunched loud like an echo that did not belong to me anymore. I looked up at my cabin, the one my grandfather built with his bare hands, and for a second it felt like I was trespassing on my own bloodline. They were waiting for me. Not friends, not neighbors, but predators with clipboards and polished boots that had never seen dirt. Veronica Hale led the charge like she owned the valley itself. Her voice carried across the meadow, sharp and hollow. She said, I was in violation of scenic standards. She said my porch was an eyesore. She said my home was hurting property values. Her words cut deeper than the mountain wind, because she was not just challenging my cabin. She was challenging my right to exist on land my family had cared for since before she was born. I wanted to laugh, but anger rose instead. I kept walking toward the door, fishing for the brass key that had hung on my keyring since I was a kid. That key had unlocked summers of fishing with my grandfather and winters of snow stacked high against the windows. That key was more than metal. It was memory. It was belonging. When the lock turned with a familiar click, I felt the strength of 60 years roar against her polished authority. But she did not stop. She barked about ordinances and buffers and community standards. She waved her rules like they were scripture written on stone. And behind her, Rick Porter clutched a manila folder with trembling hands. His eyes darted like a man who knew he was standing on a fault line ready to split. He stuttered about statutes and daily fines. He threatened $500 a day until compliance. His papers shook like they knew they were lies. Then the sheriff cruiser pulled up. Dust swirled in the dying sunlight like smoke in a saloon gunfight. Deputy Nate Ward stepped out, tired eyes under his hat. He looked at me then, at my cabin, then back at Veronica, who stood like she had already won. He pulled up the county records on his phone and showed her what I already knew. My name was on that deed, free and clear, property of the Bennett Family Trust. Her smile cracked, but she kept talking. Rick waved his folder like flimsy armor. Ward just shrugged and walked away. He was done. But I was not, because something in her eyes told me this was not the end. This was the beginning. And I was about to learn how deep her game ran. That night the silence was heavy. Not peaceful, but watching. I stood on the porch and the timber creaked under my boots. My grandfather had hammered those nails in 1962, and they still held strong. But I felt eyes on me from the tree line. The kind of eyes that do not blink. The kind of eyes that wait. I decided to check the barn. 200 feet back behind the aspens, my grandfather's barn, where the tractor and tools sat like guardians of the land. But the padlock was wrong, not the old master lock I had left in July. This was new, shiny, stamped with a serial number like it belonged to someone else, someone who had no right. My key scraped uselessly against it. The sound was like betrayal. Someone had broken into my history. I documented everything. Photos of scratches on the hasp. Close-ups of the serial number. Every detail, because my gut told me this was not random. This was invasion. It felt like someone had walked into my veins and claimed them. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, Ward returned at 9 sharp. His cruiser rolling quiet over the frost-silver meadow, he carried bolt cutters and his body camera. He asked if I was sure. He said once we opened that door, there was no going back. I nodded, because fear only grows in the dark. The lock snapped like bone. The door groaned open and the truth breathed out of the shadows. Inside crouched equipment marked with black paint. Ridgeview HOA property. Traffic cones stacked like trophies. A zero-turn mower parked like a thief hiding in plain sight. And, worst of all, a trail camera aimed straight through a crack at my cabin, watching me, watching my life. Ward bagged everything. Evidence tags, photos, SD cards sealed, his voice low with disbelief. He said this was bigger than a property line fight. This was something else, something darker. I stood there in the cold barn air, fists clenched as I stared at that camera. My cabin had been under surveillance, my life reduced to files on a card hidden in shadows. That was when I realized Veronica had not just come for my cabin. She had come for everything. And standing there, I felt my grandfather's words whisper like wind in the rafters. The land will take care of the family that takes care of it. That was the promise. That was the oath. And I knew then this fight was not about rules or standards. It was about legacy. It was about truth. And I was not backing down. What would you do if a stranger planted their lock on your barn? Would you break it and risk what might be inside? Or would you walk away and let them claim a piece of your bloodline? That was the question staring at me long after Ward drove, off with bags of evidence sealed and tagged. I called Claire Morton that afternoon, a paralegal who lived 2 towns over. Frank Dalton had told me once that Claire could read land deeds like most people read bedtime stories. She arrived with her laptop and a banker box full of documents, yellow and worn with age. She spread them across my kitchen table as if she were laying out weapons for battle. She showed me overlays and maps. She pointed to faded clauses in the original deed. Her finger tapped one sentence that seemed almost forgotten. She whispered it like it was a secret meant only for us. The Bennett Family Trust owns not just the cabin lot, but 4 connected parcels, A through D. 40 acres of valley floor, ridge to ridge, road to ridge, every inch. Her eyes gleamed when she traced a red line across the screen. Parcel D. It was, narrow and long like a noose. It included the only access road in or out of the valley. Every neighbor, every car, every truck, all of them passed over my land to reach their homes. I stared at it and felt the air leave my lungs. My grandfather had granted permission quietly. For decades, he let everyone use that road free of charge. But Claire's discovery made it clear. The easement was non-transferable. Written consent from the property owner required, and no one ever asked. Not once. That meant the Ridgeview HOA had been trespassing every single day since they formed. Every step, every wheel, every delivery truck, illegal without written consent, thousands of violations. A truth hidden in plain sight for 70 years. Claire leaned back in her chair and said softly, "This is your nuclear option. Use it wisely, because once you reveal it, the valley will never be the same." That night I could not sleep. The mountains groaned with cold wind. Shadows pressed against my windows. When I pulled the curtain aside, I saw it. A camera strapped to a tree not 50 feet from my bedroom. The lens pointed directly into my life. Not at the road. Not at a scenic buffer. At me. At where I slept. My skin crawled and I stepped back as if the glass could bite. Someone had been watching. For how long I did not know. The next morning, Brian Foster came to my cabin. He was pale and restless, his eyes darting like a hunted man. He held his phone out to me with shaking hands. He said his wife worked part-time for the HOA, filing, data entry. She had been copied by accident on an email thread. He showed me the messages. They were not about standards or community pride. They were about me. I scrolled through and saw falsified maps. Boundaries shifted 30 feet. My cabin drawn as if it trespassed. The files signed digitally by 3 board members 2 weeks before Veronica confronted me in the meadow. It was not a mistake. It was planned. A fraud staged like theater. Then, Brian pressed play on an audio file. Veronica's voice spilled into my cabin. Smooth, confident, cruel. She said they would bury me in legal fees until I sold. She bragged about doing it before in Colorado. She laughed about mountain people folding under pressure. Her voice was steady, but to me it sounded like poison. The ceramic mug in my hand cracked under the pressure of my grip. I wanted to hurl it against the wall, but I stayed still. Brian looked at me and said his wife was quitting the job. It had become too toxic. He warned me to back up everything, to protect it before it vanished. That afternoon, I drove past the eastern boundary of my land. Orange cones lined the road. A notice taped to a post declared widening for safety, freshly printed. Excavators scheduled for Monday morning before sunrise, and right beside those cones stood my red survey stakes, the same ones I had set last month. Their project zone overlapped my property like a thief laying claim. I took photos from every angle. My gut churned. This was not incompetence. This was theft measured in inches. They wanted to erase the line while the valley slept. I called Lydia Moore, a GIS analyst Claire trusted. She arrived in a van full of strange gear, GPS units, laser scanners, tools that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie. She worked in silence, except for muttering coordinates under her breath. Within 2 hours, she had proof. She toggled between county records and the HOA version of maps. Edits glowed red on her screen like open wounds. She said the boundaries had been altered little by little over 6 weeks. Incremental so no one would notice. Each change logged under the same user, Vernon H. The pattern clear as daylight. A deliberate scheme to shift my land into their control. She exported the files and handed me a copy. Her eyes serious. She said this was fraud, plain and simple. A jury would not need technical jargon to see it. That night, I sat at my table with folders spread out, evidence stacked high, photos, emails, audio recordings, maps, metadata. My cabin no longer felt like a home. It felt like a war room. Veronica's voice echoed in my head over and over. Bury him in fees. Break him. Make him fold. But she did not know the road she was standing on already belonged to me. And when the truth surfaced, it would not be her burying me. It would be her own lies burying her. Do you know the sound of a valley holding its breath? I heard it that Monday morning as I carried a steel sign to the entrance of the only road in and out. The letters were bold, private road, 48-hour grace period before access restrictions. The hammer rang like a bell when it struck the post. It was not just metal on wood. It was the sound of change. I did not want war with my neighbors. I did not want fear. That is why I spent Sunday with Claire drafting the notice carefully. The goal was not punishment, it was truth. Free temporary passes for any resident who signed acknowledgement that the road was private Bennett land. Respect before conflict, clarity before chaos. By noon, I had a folding table set up near the entrance, a stack of passes numbered, dated, and stamped. A small printer humming beside me. Families drove up cautious and curious. Jennifer Martinez was the first to step out. She put on her reading glasses and studied the paper. Her lips pressed tight when she said Veronica told us the HOA owned the road, that our dues paid for maintenance. She signed the acknowledgement. Slowly, like each stroke of the pen, was an act of defiance against a lie. One by one, others followed. Some angry, some confused, some almost relieved. I printed passes for them while explaining what Claire had uncovered. They listened. They asked questions. They nodded when they saw the deed and the easement clause that had been ignored for 70 years. By 3 in the afternoon, 14 families had signed. Relief showed in their faces. For the first time, they saw this was not neighbor against neighbor. It was neighbor against fraud. Then the 15th car came. A white Lexus. Veronica did not stop. She drove through with fury burning in her eyes. In her mirror, I saw something colder than rage. I saw fear. 2 hours later, my phone rang. A voice claimed to be code enforcement. They said I had violated commerce regulations. They said I could not restrict access to a public road. I asked for a badge number, an extension, a way to verify. The caller hung up. No courage, no truth, just another mask. The next morning, escalation arrived. A county clerk called about a temporary restraining order. Veronica was claiming prescriptive use. 5 years of continuous access creating public rights. She wanted an emergency injunction. Immediate, irreparable harm. The words were heavy, but Claire was ready. She filed counter documents. She attached affidavits. She included my grandfather's maintenance records showing decades of costs paid from our family's pocket. That afternoon, Fire Inspector Bill Harper arrived. He wore a yellow vest and carried a tablet. He walked the road with me and pointed at the slope. He pointed at the drainage ditches my grandfather had dug by hand in the 60s. He shook his head. He said if this road is private, then the HOA never had authority. That means insurance is void. That means evacuation plans fail. That means every mortgage in this valley could collapse. His report was blunt. Without legal easement, these houses sit on fragile foundations. Insurance gone, loans callable, families ruined. His words echoed through my chest like thunder. The HOA had not just threatened me, they had endangered everyone. Claire called that evening. Her voice held triumph. The county attorney declined the injunction. They reviewed the evidence. They saw the truth. Prescriptive use had no ground. Veronica's claim had died before it reached a hearing. On Thursday, I installed a gate. Not a fortress. Not intimidation. Just a keypad. A camera. A sign with clear instructions. Emergency vehicles exempt. Access codes for residents who had signed. Control, not chaos. The contractor who built the gate was older. He had seen disputes before. He said this valley would test me. He said roads carry stories of neighbors. He said speed bumps might be worth considering because people drive too fast when they do not pay for the asphalt. His words were simple but wise. I listened. That, Knight Harper emailed me. His analysis was stark. Without a legal road, every insurance policy in the valley might already be invalid. Banks could demand repayment immediately. The weight of his conclusion was almost unbearable. I looked at the glowing screen in my cabin and whispered to myself, this is leverage. This is fire. And fire can save or destroy. Days later, Inspector Diane Harper, no relation to Bill, arrived with a team. They came in a white van with equipment like crime scene investigators. She carried a metal clipboard. Her eyes scanned my land like a detective hunting clues. She said they needed to inspect unauthorized modifications. My stomach twisted when I followed her into the woods. Within an hour, they had uncovered scars. Fresh trenches for utility lines. No permits, no consent. Stumps where old pines once stood. Timber theft, she called it. Trees older than me. Gone. Their rings counted like the years of my grandfather's life, carved away without permission. She showed me aerial photos from last year compared to now. Roads widened, drainage destroyed, 15 feet stolen across. The eastern edge, $200,000 in damages. She broke it into categories: infrastructure, environmental, restoration, numbers that made my head spin, but each one proof of theft. Then Claire called with new fire in her voice. She had dug deeper into the archives. The easement clause was worse for Veronica than anyone realized. Each property needed written consent for road use individually, not collective, not HOA authority, and none existed. That meant every deed sold in this valley for the last 5 years was flawed, legally broken, millions in risk. I stared at the phone, my chest heavy. I did not just own land. I owned the fate of the valley. Veronica had gambled with lives and mortgages and futures, and her house of cards was falling. That evening, as the sun bled behind the ridges, I stood on my porch with papers in my hand. My grandfather's words echoed in the timber under my feet. Ink on land is louder than any shout. He was right. And I was about to shout louder than Veronica had ever imagined. Have you ever seen the enemy smile while their hands shake? That is what I saw when Veronica came to my cabin that Wednesday afternoon. She arrived alone. No clipboard, no board members. just an envelope clutched tight in her hand. Her white Lexus gleamed in the sun, but her eyes looked hollow. She tried to smile. It broke on her lips like glass. She said we had gotten off on the wrong foot. She said she wanted peace. She held out the envelope. I saw green edges through the flap. Stacks of hundreds. Her voice was low when she whispered 20,000 cash to sign an easement. Keep the gate open. Drop the inspections. Forget everything. Part of me wanted to throw it in her face, but another part remembered what Ward had told me. He gave me a vial of UV powder to dust the bills. Evidence of bribery could not hide from light. I took the envelope calmly, my hands steady while inside my chest my heart slammed against bone. I told her I needed time to think. I let her leave, believing she had bought me. Minutes later, Ward arrived. We shined the UV light. Her fingers glowed faint violet. Mine too, her crime written in light. Evidence sealed in bags. Ward said softly, "That is attempted bribery, a felony when tied to property fraud." Her mask was cracking, and this time the cracks were wide enough for law to enter. By Friday, the county DA opened a formal investigation. Fraud, consumer deception, misuse of authority. They stopped short of criminal charges at first, but the words they used were heavy. Pattern of deceptive practices, active review. And I knew the walls around Veronica's kingdom were closing. That same afternoon, a contractor stepped forward. He had moved survey stakes under her orders. He showed screenshots of texts with GPS coordinates she had sent. He said she told him it was HOA property. He looked ashamed. His testimony cut through the last defense she had. I spent that night at my table again, folders stacked high, audio files replaying Veronica's laughter about burying mountain people in fees, photos of falsified maps, copies of deeds, metadata logs, every page a nail in her coffin. But still my chest ached, because this was not just her downfall, this was my valley, and the valley was bleeding. Saturday came with storm clouds and a meeting at the community hall. Cars lined the road like a funeral procession. Neighbors filed in with tight shoulders and restless eyes. The air inside was heavy. No one touched the donuts. No one sipped the coffee. They waited for truth like starving people wait for bread. Veronica sat at the front with 2 board members flanking her. She still wore authority on her shoulders, but it sagged. Her smile looked brittle. My evidence boards leaned against the podium. When they called me up, the room fell silent. I began with the maps. Original county records in green, HOA edits in red. The red cuts sliced across the valley like wounds. Gasps rose from the crowd. Curses muttered under breath. For the first time, they saw how close the lies had crept to their own fences. Next, I showed the letter from the insurer. Coverage void without valid access. Mortgages callable. Homes at risk. People pulled out their phones. They snapped photos. Fear spread like wildfire. They finally saw the cliff they had been standing on. The last board showed signatures and custody logs. Ward's seal. Harper's stamp. DA file numbers. This was no longer rumor. This was evidence. And evidence has a weight heavier than any HOA fine. The room erupted, voices angry, neighbors shouting questions. Veronica stood so fast her chair clattered behind her. She screamed that I was fabricating everything. She called them sheep. She said I would burn the valley for pride. Her words cracked under the weight of her own desperation. Then Brian Foster rose from the back row. He held up his phone. He pressed play. Veronica's voice spilled out for everyone to hear. We bury him in fees until he sells. Mountain people always fold. Laughter followed on the recording. The room went silent. I watched board members shift their chairs away from her, distance themselves like soldiers abandoning a sinking ship. People stared at her with wide eyes, trust shattered. Her empire crumbled in seconds. Claire stepped up. Then. She held out the memorandum of understanding. She explained it clearly. $30 per household per month for permanent legal access, a bond for restoration, a clean resolution. Her words were calm, but firm. The choice was simple. Stability or ruin. Tom Chen signed first. Quiet man, rarely spoke. His pen moved across the paper with finality. He muttered, "Stop the bleeding." Others followed, pens scratching like rain on the roof. Within an hour, 87% had signed. Even two of Veronica's allies resigned publicly while signing. The tide had turned, but Veronica did not fall quietly. She snapped when a man asked about Colorado, about another family she had destroyed with the same scheme. She shoved him hard. He stumbled into a table. Cups and papers flew like startled birds. Phones recorded everything. Ward stepped forward from the back, his voice steady. "Ma'am, you are under arrest for assault." The clink of handcuffs echoed louder than her shouts. Neighbors watched in stunned silence as she was led out of the hall. The woman who had ruled with fear now dragged away by law. And in that silence, something shifted. Fear broke. Truth took its place. Have you ever seen a kingdom fall in a single night? That is what it felt like after Veronica was led out of the community hall in handcuffs. Neighbors stood frozen, some pale with fear, others whispering in disbelief. Chairs scraped on the floor, as people pushed back from tables as if they wanted to put distance between themselves and the woman who had ruled them for years. But the storm was only beginning. The DA confirmed the next morning that charges were being prepared. Fraud, forgery, conspiracy, assault, each word heavier than stone, each word another brick collapsing in her empire. The board scrambled to fill the vacuum. Volunteers stepped up timidly like soldiers picking through the wreckage of a battlefield. I knew the fight was not over, because fraud does not bleed out. Quietly, it twists, it hides, it claws for survival, and the valley was full of scars that still needed healing. By Monday, Claire and I sat at the county recorder's office. We signed the permanent easement agreement. The seal slammed against paper like a gavel. $30 per household per month, adjusted for inflation, a restoration bond locked in, emergency vehicles exempt, clear signage required. It was elegant. It was final. For the first time in weeks, my lungs loosened. Ink had spoken louder than Veronica ever could. That afternoon, the judge issued a 3-year no-contact order against her. She could not come within 500 feet of my land. Her assets were frozen pending trial. Her Lexus disappeared from the valley. Her name scraped off the mailbox and the sign at the community center. She had been erased from the place she thought she controlled. But erasure did not mean repair. Crews arrived to undo the damage. Illegal pavement peeled back. Drainage restored. Saplings planted where 80-year pines once stood. The scent of cedar filled the air. It smelled like my childhood. It smelled like mornings with my grandfather when he would walk the line with me and remind me the land takes care of those who take care of it. I watched each shovel of dirt like it was an act of justice. Neighbors began to come by. Some brought pies. Some brought written apologies. One teenage girl left a note on my porch. She had egged my cabin during the height of the conflict. Her note said only 3 words, "Sorry, I didn't know." And somehow that note cut deeper than any fine or signature. I heard the same story again and again. We were scared. We thought we had no choice. We believed her. People admitted they stayed quiet because they feared becoming her next target. They regretted it. They promised change. Maybe for the first time, we were not just neighbors. Maybe we were becoming a community, but the past had sharp teeth. News broke that Veronica had done the same scheme in Colorado 5 years earlier. Civil suits were waiting for her there. The state board suspended her real estate license. She faced 12 years if convicted. Her husband was charged as co-conspirator. And still, the valley buzzed with rumors. Some said she had offshore accounts. Others whispered she had allies waiting in other counties. Shadows lingered even as light poured in. Yet something else grew alongside the fear. Reform. The county passed a new measure. Annual HOA reports required. Boundaries verified against county records. Meetings recorded. Documents public. They called it the Bennett Rule. My name now inked into local law as a shield against abuse. Other counties began to discuss similar measures. What began as fraud in one valley was turning into reform across a state. One evening, Frank Dalton joined me on the porch. He carried 2 beers. He looked at the saplings swaying in the breeze. He said my grandfather would be proud. He raised his bottle in a quiet toast. I raised mine, too. For the first time in weeks, the silence felt peaceful, not like something watching, but like something resting. Yet even in peace, I could not shake the habit of listening too hard at night. Every creak in the woods made me wonder if someone would come back, if fraud dies quickly or if it lingers waiting for another chance. The valley felt changed. Children laughed again. Neighbors waved instead of looking away. But deep down, I knew scars never vanish completely. They remain as reminders. They whisper lessons, and the lesson was clear. Peace is not granted by policy. It is built by people who refuse to be pushed out. Do you know the sound of land crying? It is not loud. It is not thunder. It is the hush of wind over stumps where old pines once stood. It is water carving new channels where ditches once held it steady. That is what I heard as crews worked day after day to undo the scars the HOA left behind. Each fallen tree was a memory stolen. Each trench a wound cut into my grandfather's promise. But while the land healed, the law tightened. Evidence piled high on county desks. Contractors testified about false orders. Inspectors logged unauthorized work. Neighbors whispered about forged signatures. Every thread pulled the same direction, toward Veronica, toward a pattern of deception, so obvious no judge could ignore it. Then came the revelation that shook the valley deeper than any saw or bulldozer. Forensic accountants traced HOA funds. They found payments hidden in invoices. They found contractors paid for improvements to Veronica's own home, billed as community work. $90,000 diverted. Misuse of fiduciary duty. The board voted to strip her title. She was no longer president. She was a thief with lipstick. The community center sign with her name was taken down. Neighbors watched in silence as her letters clattered to the ground. It felt like a funeral, but not for a person. For a reign built on intimidation, still fear lingered. Because even stripped of power, she was not yet sentenced. Rumors spread of appeals and hidden accounts. I told myself rumors were shadows. Evidence was light, but even light flickers when wind howls through the valley. One evening I stood by the barn, the same barn where I had found the HOA mower and the trail camera aimed at my cabin. Now it stood empty except for my grandfather's old tools. I ran my hand over the wood, rough, weathered, but solid. I thought of how easily lies can spread into places they do not belong. I thought of how vigilance is the only lock that truly holds. Days later, the news broke. Formal charges filed. Fraud, forgery, assault. Potential sentence 12 years. Her husband named as co-conspirator. Civil suits from Colorado reopening wounds she left behind. The valley buzzed. Some celebrated, others pitied. But all of them knew the fight was bigger than one woman. It was about trust. It was about what happens when neighbors surrender their voices to fear. The local news arrived. Cameras on my porch, reporters asking questions. They filmed the cabin. The same porch Veronica once called an eyesore. They called it heritage. They called it history. I stood there with microphones in my face, and all I could think was how my grandfather would have hated the noise. He built this place for silence, for family. Not for headlines. But maybe headlines were needed. Because what happened here was not just my fight. It was a warning, a lesson written in timber and stone. When the story aired, neighbors across the county watched. Other communities saw themselves in our valley. They saw how quickly power could twist when no one asked questions. And maybe they decided to stand a little taller, to read a little closer, to push back when authority whispered threats. The valley began to breathe again. Children rode bikes down the road without fear of fines. Neighbors gathered without worrying about bylaws. Laughter returned like rain after drought. But under it, all the scars reminded us. Peace is fragile. One night, Brian Foster knocked on my door again. He looked tired but calmer than before. He told me his wife had found another job. He said their family felt safe again. But then his voice dropped. He asked me if I thought it was truly over. I looked past him into the dark meadow and admitted I did not know. Because power does not die quietly. Sometimes it waits. Brian nodded. He said he had kept backups of the emails and recordings, just in case. I thanked him. Because trust is good, but proof is better. As the days rolled into weeks, I noticed something changing in the valley. People waved at me now. They stopped to talk. They brought food. They helped with repairs. It felt like the first true community I had ever known here. Not manufactured, not written in bylaws, but born from hardship. And yet every night when I locked the cabin door, I still paused. I still looked to the tree line. I still listened for silence that watched instead of rested. Because once you have been targeted, you never stop wondering if someone is waiting in the dark with another scheme. The land heals. The neighbors heal. But the lesson remains. Strength is not in rules. It is not in fines. It is in standing your ground when everything around you tries to move you. That is the truth my grandfather left me. That is the truth Veronica tried to erase, and that is the truth that carried me through the storm. What does justice look like when it finally arrives? It is not fireworks. It is not cheering. Sometimes it is just the heavy stamp of a judge's order on old paper. That is what I saw as Veronica's empire collapsed piece by piece. The court froze her assets. The DA built their case. Civil suits from Colorado stacked against her. The state board suspended her license. Each blow chipped away at the mask she wore for so long. But the heaviest blow was closer to home. The neighbors she once controlled now stood against her. The valley no longer whispered in fear. It spoke in voices steady and clear. Restoration. Work continued. Illegal pavement torn up. Drainage restored. Timber replanted. The air smelled alive again. I walked the boundary lines with crews. Each repaired ditch felt like a stitch pulling a wound closed. Each sapling felt like hope taking root. It was not fast. It was not easy. But it was healing. At night, I sat with documents spread on my table. I no longer studied them with anger. I studied them with purpose. Because this was bigger than me, bigger than one cabin. The Bennett Trust now held the future of an entire valley. $30 a month was more than money. It was a contract, a bond of respect, a reminder that land and community must walk together. Yet even as the valley healed, shadows still lingered. Rumors swirled that Veronica had secret accounts, that she would appeal, that she would return. Some whispered that others on the board might try to continue her schemes quietly. Fear is like mold. It grows in silence. I refused to let silence return. One Saturday evening, neighbors gathered at my barn. The same barn once filled with stolen equipment, now strung with lights, tables lined with food, children running in the meadow, laughter rising where once there had been threats. It was the first community barbecue in years, and it felt real, not forced by rules, not staged by authority. Real. Frank stood beside me as the sun dipped behind the ridge. He raised his beer. He said, "Your grandfather would be proud." I felt the truth in his voice. I felt the weight of it in my chest. My grandfather always said, "The land will take care of the family that takes care of it." That night, I saw it come alive. Because the land was not just caring for me. It was binding the valley together. But still, I listened harder than I should when the night grew quiet. Still, I watched the tree line. Still, I wondered if someone somewhere was planning another theft. That is what betrayal does. It changes the way you hear silence. The news cameras came back, this time not for conflict, but for closure. They filmed the repaired ditches, the replanted trees. They filmed children laughing in the meadow where deputies once cut evidence bags. They called it reform born from resistance. They called it a cautionary tale. My porch swing creaked in the background of their segment. A simple piece of wood my grandfather had built still standing, still undefeated. The Bennett rule spread across counties. Annual HOA audits, boundaries checked, meetings recorded, transparency enforced. It was not revenge. It was protection, a shield written into law to keep others safe. My valley's pain had become someone else's armor. And still, I wondered if justice was enough. Because money can be repaid, trees can be replanted, but trust once broken never returns fully. I saw it in my neighbor's eyes, gratitude mixed with caution, support mixed with guilt. They brought pies, they brought apologies, but deep down they knew they had been silent too long. Silence is its own kind of betrayal. One day a man approached me quietly. He said his signature had been forged on a petition against me. He had been out of the country at the time. He said he was sorry. His voice cracked when he admitted he should have spoken up sooner. I told him what I told everyone. What mattered was that he stood here now. What mattered was that he saw the truth. The valley was finding balance again. But balance is fragile. It can tip with one push. And though Veronica was gone, her shadow still stretched across the ridges at dusk. That night, as I locked my door, I thought of my grandfather again. He never lived to see this fight, but he prepared me for it without knowing. He taught me that land is not just dirt and timber. It is memory. It is belonging. It is responsibility. And when someone tries to steal it, you do not just fight for soil. You fight for the people who will one day walk it. And as the stars spread over the valley, like lanterns, I whispered a promise into the dark. This land will not fall, not while I breathe, not while the Bennett Trust holds ink stronger than lies. What does peace feel like after months of war? It does not roar, it does not shout. It settles quietly like dust after a storm. That is what I felt as summer came to the valley, and the scars slowly faded. The barn, once locked with someone else's, padlock now opened wide with strings of lights across the rafters. Neighbors gathered for another barbecue. Children chased fireflies in the meadow. Laughter rolled across the grass. The same ground that once echoed with arguments now sang with voices of people sharing food and stories. I stood near the edge of the field and watched. My grandfather's words whispered back to me. The land will take care of the family that takes care of it. He had been right, but the truth had grown larger. The land takes care of the community that learns to respect it. The restoration continued week by week. Illegal trenches filled, ditches dug again by careful hands, saplings watered and staked upright, each act a thread stitching the wound tighter. Watching the land heal was like watching justice take shape in soil and timber. Not fast, not easy. But real neighbors brought apologies in many forms. Apple pies, letters, handshakes. Some could barely look me in the eye. One teenage girl brought a hand-drawn card with shaky letters that simply said, "Thank you for protecting us." I kept that card on the shelf beside my grandfather's old compass, proof that even the young understood what was at stake. The news spread beyond our valley. Other counties adopted the Bennett Rule, transparency laws, annual reports, verified maps, public records. What began as one HOA's corruption had become a shield for thousands. People in other towns wrote letters to me. They said our fight gave them courage to stand against their own boards. They said our story showed that silence is not safety. It is surrender. Veronica's downfall grew darker by the week. Criminal charges moved forward. Civil suits in Colorado advanced. Her assets frozen. Her influence shattered. The woman who once strutted across the meadow with a clipboard now stood in court with chains of evidence around her. Fraud, forgery, bribery, assault. She faced years in prison. The empire she built on fear had collapsed into rubble, and yet I did not feel triumph. What I felt was relief. Relief that the valley had survived. Relief that my neighbors had seen the truth. Relief that my grandfather's cabin still stood where it always had. Weathered wood against mountain wind. Proof that some things cannot be erased no matter how much pressure is applied. One evening, I sat on the porch swing. The same swing Veronica once called an eyesore. It creaked in rhythm with the night breeze. Stars burned above the ridge. I thought about everything we had endured. Locks on barns, cameras in trees, forged signatures, fake maps, lies stacked higher than mountains. And through it all, the truth had held. Frank joined me with 2 beers. He raised his bottle and said again that my grandfather would be proud. I raised mine and let the silence between us speak. Because sometimes silence is not fear, sometimes it is peace. The valley was different now, not perfect, but stronger. People no longer whispered. They spoke, they questioned, they stood together. Community built not by bylaws or fines, but by shared struggle. Maybe that was the gift hidden inside the fight. The HOA had tried to divide us with rules and threats. But in the end, their scheme united us in a way nothing else could have. And still some nights I listened harder than I should. Still I wondered if someone somewhere might try again. Because power never sleeps completely. It waits. It watches. But now, the valley knows how to fight. And I know how to stand. As I closed my eyes on that porch, I heard my grandfather's voice one more time. Ink on land is louder than any shout. He was right. The ink of our deeds. The ink of our agreements. The ink of our unity. Louder than threats, louder than fear. So what does peace feel like after months of war? It feels like neighbors laughing under barn lights. It feels like children chasing fireflies. It feels like a valley breathing again. And maybe it feels like justice. Not loud, not violent, but steady. If you are still here, I would like to hear your thoughts. Because stories like this do not just belong to one man or one valley. They belong to anyone who has ever been pushed. Anyone who has ever been told to fold. Anyone who has ever stood their ground when everything tried to move them. Stay sharp, stay grounded, and never forget. Peace is not granted. Peace is built. You've heard this confession. Now wait until you hear the next one.